All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Brian Anderson. I'm from the MITRE Corporation, and this is the first in a series of monthly webinars we have planned for the Vaccination Credential Initiative. You'll notice that if you're a participant of this, the microphone function is turned off, but we have enabled a Q&A function you'll find in the bottom middle section of the Zoom window. We encourage everyone that has questions to please use the Q&A function. All of the panelists on today will be monitoring the Q&A icon, and any questions that come in, we will try our best to answer in a timely fashion during the webinar. And certainly if we're not able to answer it during the webinar, we would love to follow up with you and answer any and all questions. There's also a chat window. We'll try to monitor that as well, but we certainly prefer any specific questions to the panelists to come in to that Q&A function. Thank you so much. And with that, we're going to go ahead and kick things off. We have a packed agenda. I believe first up is Dr. Brad Perkins from the Commons Project. Dr. Perkins.
Thanks, Brian. Delighted to be here. Thank you to all. I'm a co-founder of the Commons Project Foundation and the Chief Medical Officer for the Commons Project. I spent a couple of decades at CDC doing global outbreak investigations. I led the anthrax investigation for CDC after 9/11, and I served as the head of strategy at CDC for a number of years before leaving about a decade ago. Reese, if I could have the first slide. One more. I think this is a good segue into giving you a few thoughts about how we see the near-term future, and in particular, the relevance of our collective work at the Vaccine Credential Initiative in pandemic recovery. This is a recent tweet by Eric Topol that I think gives you a great sense of where we are in the US, sort of the bad and really ugly and sort of hopeful aspects of the pandemic at this point. Of course, the epidemiology has been nothing short of catastrophic, but I think there's a bright spot, and I want to acknowledge all of you that are on the call that served as frontline healthcare workers and other essential personnel, because although we failed on multiple levels with this pandemic in the United States, I think the performance of our health system and the people working in those systems has been spectacular and heroic in many dimensions. Of course, the bright spot here is that the U.S. had a spectacular series of innovations in developing a vaccine, or a number of vaccines that appear to be highly efficacious and increasingly looking like they're effective in population use, and looks like we're sorting out our logistics and to the point that we've got sort of 30% of the vaccine doses administered in the world have been in the United States. So really bad and ugly in some dimensions, and really spectacular in other dimensions. Let me give you sort of a forecast from my perspective and careful reading of the medical literature about what this means about the immediate usefulness of the vaccine credential and diagnostic credentials here in the near-term future. On the next slide. These vaccines, for the first time in the pandemic, are really providing a line of sight to extinguishing transmission, and doing that by maintaining high vaccine coverage. It's variable depending on sort of what the effective R number is in populations, but the general notion of achieving 75 to 80% should work in most populations under most conditions, including resuming fairly normal activities with or without mask. I'd say that's an unknown at this point. Of course, we've never done anything like trying to vaccinate the entire world. And there's really a complex set of requirements that all of you are hearing about in the news every day, from supply to logistics to access to demand. And this is importantly, you can't look at this challenge from a single country perspective. It's really, we need a global view, and I've been very hopeful seeing vaccines start to arrive in Africa and other developing countries. Next slide. But in addition to the logistics and other challenges with vaccine distribution, there's three wild cards. And I'm watching the literature very carefully to see how these sort out. And it's important to highlight that each of these three uncertainties are vaccine specific in character. First is the effectiveness of vaccines to prevent asymptomatic infection and transmission. Second is we still don't know the duration of vaccine protection for either symptomatic or asymptomatic infections. And then, of course, popularly in the news right now, there's a number of variants which may escape vaccination protection. So if you sort of pull all these strings together, my forecast is that the work we're doing in VCI is going to have urgent global, US and global relevance for at least the next 3 years, and that potentially longer than that, based on how these uncertainties play out. I would acknowledge, though, and emphasize that VCI is going to have a life beyond that. And certainly everything we're doing at the Commons Project Foundation is built for the long term. And the notion of using these health data credentials to assemble lifelong longitudinal immunization records for people at a global level is attractive and something that we're looking forward to post-pandemic. So Brian, thank you, and I'll hand it over.
Great. All right. So thanks for that, Brad. So I wanted to briefly share with our members a little bit more about the initiative and how the steering group has begun to frame the work that we're doing. What you see on your screen now is a refined way that we have begun to describe this to stakeholders that have reached out to us, various government officials, international bodies, and important members like yourself. It's not meant to be the definitive end to how we are describing this initiative, but rather our first initial attempt to clarify the work we're doing in this space. We've launched this just recently within the past 5 months. And so there's been a lot of attention and a lot of interest from many of you and from others outside of VCI. And so we welcome your feedback and your input. This document or this content will be shared on our website afterwards, but I wanted to walk through with you on this call how we're describing the Vaccination Credential Initiative. The main thrust of what we are trying to do is to harmonize the standards and produce an implementation guide needed to support signed clinical data that's bound to an individual identity. The initial work that we're doing, the initial use case, is to enable an end user to have access to a signed copy of that clinical data in a standard format. That format is the Smart Health Card format that can be shared with another entity, such as an airline, a hotel, a school. And that entity can verify that that identity matches their records and that that data is intact, right? That it's not tampered with. They can then do whatever they want with it, such as embed it within a boarding pass or an ID badge, or work with a third-party vendor to leverage that in some other format. The attached diagram, we found this helpful as part of our description of what the VCI initiative is about and what the work we're doing in our use cases is about with this diagram, right? So the production of the Smart Health Card up in the upper left-hand corner of your screen is really where we are focusing the work we're doing in this initiative. Other components, such as digital wallets, the important work that verifiers or issuers will be doing, or identity proofing, is out of scope, right? We are aware of, we are certainly looking to collaborate with other stakeholders and coalitions that are doing work in those important areas like identity proofing, building trust frameworks between issuers and verifiers. All of that is important work, but that is outside of the scope of what we are initially trying to tackle as the very important initial use cases for the vaccination credential initiative. The other important point that we wanted to raise is that no one entity holds IP rights to the work that we're doing here. This is open source. This is freely available. It's meant to be empowering and enabling of all of the individuals that want to make use of it. We believe that a vaccination credential should be accessible to everyone, and that it is important as we look to reopen safely and quickly that we leave no one behind. And so an additional scope and important part of this effort is the development of machine readable paper-based QR codes. So that is an important element of this effort as well. The other points I wanted to make is that verifiers following the specifications that we're describing in the Smart Health Card Implementation Guide have a free path to be able to validate their signatures with no prearrangement, no transactional costs. There's a very straightforward way where verifiers can validate the signatures on a health card by using the publicly available keys and resources that issuers would be publishing. So we have much more technical updates to come on that, but I wanted to make sure that everyone on our call and in the member understand what the VCI effort is about, what our initial focus is on, and also understanding what we're not about, what we're not focusing on initially, which is not to say that those areas of focus are not important. It's just those are the areas that we're not focusing on. And happy to take any questions or thoughts or feedback in the Q&A or in the chat window as we go along, because I know that that's an important topic that's come up with many of you on the call today. Next slide. All right, so I wanted to share with you guys just a bit on what participation looks like within the Vaccination Credential Initiative. So general membership involves being added to the mailing list, being able to participate and invited to these monthly webinars, and being able to participate in some of the ad hoc working groups that we're standing up. Those working groups you can see listed out here. We have a steering group, which is composed of members that were initially helping to found this effort and have put in a lot of technical resources to help develop this open source standard, and more to come on who those are very soon. But then under that steering group are working groups, and you can see them listed out here. They have the technologies working group, registries working group, health plans, health systems, the general membership of which is this webinar, as well as the specific implementers working group. Now these working groups meet at a differing cadence. Some meet weekly, some have regular chats that are going on all the time. Others meet less frequently. And so if you are a member today and you'd like to be involved in one of these working groups, certainly recommend reaching out to us and letting us know what your thoughts are, and we'll be happy to try our best to plug you in to the appropriate working group. And I think with that, I'll hand it over, I believe, to the next person on the agenda. I think that's Paul.
Great. Thank you, Brian. I'm Paul Meyer. I'm the CEO of the Commons Project Foundation. First, I want to thank everyone for participating. I also want to thank our colleagues, Brian and many others who have worked so hard to bring VCI together and really build on a lot of really hard work in defining the spec. I think we're at an exciting point because we really are. I think that the spec, as you'll hear shortly from Josh Mandel and Reese and others, is getting pretty well developed. And so we've been working very closely with sort of early adopters, early implementers, but we're now at the point to start to mainstream this and hopefully really have this spec and this model deployed at scale. I wanted to just take a moment to talk about the use cases, and we're working with many of the folks in this call already on some of these use cases. But this is frankly, a complex and sort of rapidly developing dynamic ecosystem. I wanted to sort of step through the process and the use case and the flows, just because I think there's a lot of confusion about how this all works and what it means. And certainly, as we're rolling up our sleeves now with some of the the pharmacy chains and the health plans and the hospital systems and registries, and actually doing it and actually getting these issued and getting these into people's hands and being able to kind of connect the end-to-end use cases, I think it's important to just sort of break down the process. And also talk about, to build on something Brian said, talk about the value of this open interoperable model. Again, this is, a lot of these use cases have been proven out in sort of, initial demonstrations with sort of kind of closed networks. The whole principle here is to do this in an open interoperable way. So if I sort of step through this diagram, sort of step by step, it really starts with the sources of the data, the issuers, whether it's a hospital system, a pharmacy, a lab, a health plan, or critically a state immunization registry that are the holders of the records. The principle behind VCI and the commitment from those organizations is a commitment to provide this record. Again, we're talking about vaccination credentials, but actually the work, as you'll hear from Josh shortly, that led to this actually began with lab tests and diagnostics. But it starts with a commitment from those institutions to make this information available using this open standard and this spec. Obviously, listed here are some of our VCI member technology partners that, like Epic, like Cerner, like Microsoft, Oracle, Salesforce, that are operating some of the systems that are used by some of those issuers. But regardless of the technology platform, there's a commitment to use the standard to actually provide this credential to people. What does that actually mean? The credential basically can either be issued on a piece of paper as a PDF through a portal. It can be made available digitally. Ultimately, it's giving that credential to a patient, a person. And then this is critical. They should be able to take that anywhere. They can import it into the app of the data source, right? We're working with pharmacy chains who've got their own apps and health plans and hospitals, but they can also import it into other apps, Apple Health, Common Health, and other apps. And remember, there's a lot of attention, and we're certainly in the middle of this with Common Pass, of focusing on airlines and all these sort of reopening use cases. But I think it's really important that we're building and implementing a standard that can be used for healthcare data interoperability in general. We've all been working, I think most of the people on this phone call have been working on healthcare data interoperability standards long before COVID, and we'll continue that long after COVID recedes. And we're certainly working on a model that isn't just about getting on airplanes or going to concerts, but ultimately can help catalyze the movement of health interoperability more generally. Once the person has that credential in their control, then downstream they can use it for the kinds of use cases we're talking about, either directly to a verifier or increasingly through Health Pass and or verifier platforms like the one we operate, Common Pass, Clear, Amadeus, Affinity, IATA. There are a number of these. But ultimately, the benefit of this open interoperable model is that those downstream verifiers can read and verify, to Brian's point. So I just wanted to walk this through. We obviously can talk more in the Q&A section about just the practicalities of this, but I think just very simplistically, the way this use case are playing out in as we're moving into implementation is, someone gets vaccinated, they get either a text or an email notifying them, hey, you've got or a piece of paper printed and handed to them, but let's say a text or email notifying them that they have this credential available to them. They can log into a portal, they can go to a website and pull it into any app, emphasis on the word any, and then support all of these downstream use cases. So that hopefully gives a high level framing of what we're trying to do here. And let me then, I think, pass it over to Reese, who is our next speaker.
Thanks, Paul. And so, right now we want to talk about the standards that VCI is rallying around, helping develop and implementing. And really there are two core specifications that VCI is working with. There's the Smart Health Cards framework, which provides that overall architecture of how we're going to enable individuals with a verifiable copy of their health information. And then a complementary implementation guide, which applies that framework to vaccinations and specifically COVID-19 as well. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Josh to talk first about Smart Health Cards framework. And so Josh, if you want the screen share or anything, just let me know.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm going to try screen sharing, but it looks like I don't have permission. So if you can grant it, that's great. Otherwise, I'll just talk through and share links. Oh, that'll do it. So I'm going to give a very quick tour. Let me just make sure, Reese, that my timing is right here. I'm targeting about 5 minutes for an overview to the Smart Health Cards framework.
Yep, you're all set, and we're a little ahead of schedule. Perfect.
So I shared a link earlier, but I'll just copy it in here as well. The page that I'm going to show is this smarthealth.cards website. Oh, and I want to send that to everyone, not just panelists. And the idea here is just to briefly restate the conceptual model that we've seen. An issuer, like an organization that administers vaccines or even an immunization registry system, can create a smart health card, which it hands off to an individual consumer who can keep it within an app of their choice or physically printed on a piece of paper. And the consumer can share that with verifiers as they see fit. And those are the 3 key roles that we talk about in this specification. What I want to do in the next 4 minutes is just take you on a very quick tour through the spec. There's going to be some technical details here, and if they're interesting to you, great. That'll give you a starting point that you can use to dig in further. And if they're not, I'll at least make it quick. So the aim here is basically to make sure that an individual can either use a piece of paper or a health wallet app of their choice and pull a credential into it. The basic data flow is there are a few different ways that you can, as a consumer, get access to this kind of credential. One might be physically on a piece of paper. Somebody prints it for you as part of your initial immunization visit or after the fact. So that's a paper-based workflow. Or alternatively, you could access this credential by signing into a portal or connecting to an API. So we define a few different methods for getting access to one of these credentials. We define a couple of file formats. So you can represent one of these things as a file that can be shared or as a QR code that can be scanned. And those files are also accessible over a FHIR API. So I want to say mostly a few things about the data model to start. So the idea here is that one of these credentials, one of these smart health cards, includes information about who you are. So just a couple of identity attributes about you. And we're really focused on things like name and birth date, just enough information to bind this to outside identity systems, and not so much that sharing one of these credentials is going to be sharing more information about you than that. And then in addition to those identity data, we have a set of clinical data, which in our use case for immunizations is generally a set of FHIR immunization resources indicating what products you received and when you received them. So all of this gets packaged into a signed credential, which is to say a JSON structure that gets prepared in a very specific way and has cryptographic signatures applied. And so there's details about exactly what those protocols look like. The issuer, when they're creating one of these health cards, generates a set of cryptographic keys that they can use to create these signatures. Those keys follow certain standards. And they also host the public keys associated with these signatures at what's called a well-known URL. And the idea here is that anyone out there can discover the public keys associated with an issuer just by fetching this JSON file from the issuer's website. So issuers make the keys available in that way. They publish a key file that looks something like this example here, following the JSON web key specification from IETF. And then there's just a couple of details that I want to share in terms of how these cards are put together. So the first is the actual serialization details. We use a standard called JSON web signatures for packaging all this information into a small payload that can be cryptographically signed. And so the payload looks something like this, where there's information about the issuer. This is the organization that created the credential and gives it to an individual consumer. Each health card has a set of types, which indicates what is this card all about. So generically, we just say this is a health card, but then we can apply additional types to say, for example, this contains immunization records, or to say this contains COVID-19 information. And this array of types describes the story about what's contained inside of this credential. And then we use the FHIR standard, Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, to convey a bundle of FHIR resources that tell this clinical story about who the patient is and what results or immunizations they've received. And this basic structure is what's taken and signed. And the goal is to keep the actual content of these things small for a few reasons. One is information minimization. So we don't want to share more information than is necessary for this use case of demonstrating immunization status. And the second reason is that we want these health cards to fit inside of QR codes so that they can easily be printed or scanned across devices. And QR codes can store only a limited amount of data. So we have a few techniques that we use to keep these cards small. One is by limiting the information that goes inside. Some of them are syntactic, so we minify the content, we apply compression, and then we strip out fields like textual descriptions that aren't really necessary for processing information. So display or HTML renderings of these kinds of data, which the FHIR specification allows for. We generally want to keep those things out of a health card so that we can keep them small and focused. And that's the basic idea, is that you can take that payload and put it in a QR code. The only other piece of the spec that I want to show you in just 1 minute is our examples page, which you can get to from the menu here, which shows you sort of top to bottom what a health card looks like. And it shows you the stages of creating these health cards. So at the very end of this example, you see a QR code, which shows you an example of how this can be printed on a piece of paper or displayed on a mobile phone screen. What do you actually get if you scan this card or scan this QR code? What you get is the value inside of this example file here called numeric value. So every smart health card QR will start with a string SHC for smart health card, and then it contains a set of binary data encoded with these decimal numbers. And that looks like just an opaque, very long string. But if you decode it appropriately, what you get is a JSON web signature, which is this kind of structure. And is in turn, if we continue unpeeling the onion here, what we get to is this kind of payload. So if you verify the signature on that JWS object and correctly decompress the contents, you get out this story here, which tells me about the issuer that generated these credentials, tells me that it's a health card that has to do with COVID-19 immunizations. It tells me that the patient for this health card is John B. Any person born on this date. And then it has information about the fact that this particular immunization product was given and the date on which it was given. And we have that record for 2 different immunization doses. And so a verifier who scans this QR code can take this issuer URL, discover the public keys associated with the issuer by appending this well-known /jwchaos.json, and check that the signature matches what was advertised here as the public signing key for this issuer. So that's kind of a whirlwind tour of what we aim to specify at the framework level. And let me turn back over to Reese for a view on the specific data profiles that we use in FHIR to capture the clinical information.
Thanks, Josh. Let me just share my screen again here. Hopefully everybody can see that. So, we've talked a little bit about the framework now, about how we can do this, but it's also important that we say, specifically when we're applying it to COVID-19 and vaccinations, that making sure we're all on the same page, using common terminologies, and expecting the common payloads that will be included and shared. And so I'm actually going to turn it over to Max to give a really quick overview of that specification. So Max, if you could unmute and take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Max Masnick. I'm an epidemiologist and a software architect at MITRE, and I'm leading the team that's working on the FHIR implementation guide. So like Reese and Josh were saying, the goal of this implementation guide is to represent the patient and the clinical data that's specific to COVID that's passed in that JSON that Josh was just showing inside the Smart Health card. So what we're doing inside this FHIR implementation guide is providing profiles for different FHIR resources. So we have a profile for patient, for immunization, and also a profile for observation. And these are all standard FHIR objects that represent those different types of data in a standardized way. So the patient and the immunization resources are pretty self-explanatory. The observation resource is actually for representing COVID-related laboratory results. So that could be a PCR test for showing that someone is COVID negative, or another COVID-related lab test. We're working with implementers to figure out exactly the minimum amount of information that we need to be specifying inside the implementation guide to pass inside the bundle to figure out, or to allow verifiers to verify the credential. So one of the concerns is not passing too much information. For example, we wouldn't want to pass social security numbers or MRNs as part of this because that's not appropriate to be passed on to verifiers. The other concern, like Josh was saying, is making sure that we're not providing too much information that won't fit inside the printed QR code. And in the implementation guide, we go through specifics about which data should be included or excluded. In terms of the current state of the implementation guide, we're pushing towards a stable release right now. We're hoping to have this in the next few weeks. And that tiny URL at the bottom of the slide shows the implementation guide. I think Josh also shared the URL earlier in the chat, and it's also linked to at smarthealth.cards as well. This is what the implementation guide looks like. These are the profiles here, so you can see the different patient immunization and observation profiles. And we actually have two different versions for each profile. We have the left-hand one for specifying all the data that's allowable, and then we have a special data minimization profile. And that's specifically to help issuers figure out whether they are providing just the minimal information or whether they are letting other information slip in. And the hope is that issuers will be able to conform to the data minimization profiles unless they want to intentionally provide additional information that they believe will be useful for verifiers. And this is just a view of, this is a standard FHIR output from the implementation guide publisher that HL7 provides. And that may look kind of strange to someone who is not working on FHIR, but for those of us who live inside of FHIR IGs, it's a very familiar way to represent the different elements that, that comprise these different resources. So I think with that, Reese, unless you want me to go through anything else, I'll turn it back over.
I think that's perfect. Thanks a lot, Max. And I think next, we want to talk about how we're actually implementing these specifications. So both of the specs that we just shared, they're open standards, freely available, and you can find them on GitHub with some of the links, which we can share again at the end of the slides. But we wanted to invite a couple folks from the community who are actually working to implement the Smart Health Card standards and give them a chance to talk. So I think first we have Mike from Cerner.
Thanks, Reese. Appreciate it. So I was just asked to speak a little bit to Cerner's involvement with VCI and the work that we're doing. So we are participating actively in the development of both of the specifications that were just covered by Max and Josh, actively participating in those, and as Cerner does with a lot of the emerging standards, and especially in the FHIR and smart healthcare space. And this has been good for me because the questions in the chat, the Q&A has been helpful for me as well to learn a little bit more about the world outside of an implementer of this standard. As far as Cerner's plans for this standard, we've said this publicly elsewhere, but there is the goal of, as this standard matures, being able to release a health card endpoint or API through our existing Ignite API platform, which is what exposes data within our Millennium EHR. So that's how we plan to roll this out. That would follow the pattern as Josh was outlining of a FHIR request pattern, and being able to support that. So app developers already part of Cerner's code program would be able to take advantage of a new endpoint, and obviously net new applications could register, become a partner with Cerner, and also consume that endpoint to retrieve these verified credentials in the short term, representing COVID-related health facts. Right now, the work is in prototyping, working through the spec with MITRE and others, and we are actively doing that with the goal of rolling this out broadly in the second half of this year. Between now and then, we are working within this group to harden our implementation, improve our implementation, and frankly, just keep pace with the rate that the spec is changing as we continue to improve it. So that's the piece that I wanted to say, and I do appreciate the opportunity to listen in and also share the good work that's being done on this front.
Thanks, Mike. And I think next we have Will and Adam from Mass General Brigham.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity to talk. So my name is Will Gordon. I am a physician at the Brigham in Boston, and working closely with Adam Landman, who is not on right now, but asked to speak about the provider perspective, and as we work towards understanding the implications for initiatives like VCI and how we can potentially be helpful. So if you go to the next slide. So I think, and just to highlight that there's a good amount of work that's been done in thinking about the broader issue here, which is just enabling patients to have access to their health data. And so our organization was an early participant in Sync for Science, which was an early research pilot, also one of the first implementations for Apple Health Records on iPhone back in 2018. We've been a collaborator for Common Health. We now have that implemented as well for the Android equivalent or Android option for patients. We've done a good amount of research on patient access APIs and the implications of an early usage, which we've published in a few forums. And we use Epic, the Epic EHR across all of our hospitals. And I think something important that Adam's actually led is we were very early on recognized the need to directly engage around this idea of some sort of credential for allowing access to different types of services based on some sort of status. And so COVID Pass, which a very early application built at Mass General Brigham, which went live, I think in March or April of last year, is what is used every day by our staff to enter buildings and to self-attest to symptoms. And on the right, there's a screenshot. I put that there just to highlight that this problem of allowing folks to indicate some sort of health status in order to return to work or access other services is really important. And we are using this now. 50,000 employees a day are self-attesting. We are also exposing through this app to our employees vaccination status. And you can see on the top there, my vaccination status, as well as other relevant data. So we are already doing some of this, again, not in a digitally signed way with a QR code, but at least in exposing this data for our employees. Go to the next. Great. So I think there's a couple things as we've gotten involved in this initiative. Some really interesting questions have been raised, and I raised them here just to highlight how thoughtful everyone's been in thinking through this, because I think it's not totally straightforward. And so the first one, which may need little motivation to this group, is can patients access their immunization records digitally? Is that a possibility? And I think we've done a lot of work in trying to emphasize that this data is already available via the Patient Access API. Patients have the right to this data through a variety of mechanisms, primarily the HIPAA privacy rule, and through APIs now through the 21st Century Cures Act and final rule. So this data is already made available to patients today. They can already access their immunization record. I think one of the biggest questions, and Brad alluded to this early on, is, as well as there's been a good amount of lay press on this, what are the equity considerations behind this type of initiative and requiring something like a vaccine for access to services, whether it's travel, entertainment, et cetera. And so we've had discussions around sort of non-digital options, for example, PDFing the barcode, making that available as a printout. But again, it doesn't really fully address this important concern. There are issues around development. Who's going to build this? Will our EHR vendor build this? Like, Cerner or Epic, are they going to build it? Or will it be a custom developed solution? Are the standards mature enough to develop against? I know there's been a lot of work, and you just saw Josh talk about this and developing this over the last many months. One of the realities of immunization data is that a lot of the data is actually in state registries. We're not going to, healthcare organizations are not going to be necessarily the only place vaccinating, and in some cases they're going to be a minority. So how do we deal with the fact that immunization data is being imported into our EHR from an external source? Who signs that? Do we sign that or not? One of the implementation realities is how do we sort of test this iteratively? Can we use a smaller set of patients, like our employees, for example? And then I think some other issues that have come up. What's the trust model here? What's our relationship with holders and verifiers? and what's our organizational risk. This notion of digitally signing something as a healthcare organization, does that add additional risk to the fidelity and quality of the data? So you can go to the next slide. So we have, so an internal team has been meeting regularly to kind of go through this, working both internally as well as with the various working groups that MITRE and TCP have been facilitating to try to really advance the standard and understand how we can help, with how the provider perspective can help and how we can actually contribute back to this. And so a lot of, as I mentioned, a lot of important considerations have been raised. What's the right trust model? How do we deal, for example, with the write back use cases, among other things. We've found that this approach, multi-stakeholder, not-for-profit, transparent, has been very effective, and we've really enjoyed engaging with that, and it's been really moving forward. It's been tremendous to see. And I think there's a bigger question here, which again has been alluded to. I think Paul mentioned this. What does it mean for a healthcare organization to digitally sign something, whether it's a credential or something else? What are the implications across multiple domains? And I think this is a great way to understand that, because I think this initiative does become bigger than just COVID vaccines, right? That this notion is a much more important and fundamental concept. So working to understand that through these types of initiatives is really important. I think it's my last slide.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, Mike, and everybody else for speaking. So I think that brings us to the end. So maybe Brian Anderson, do you want to read us out here?
Great, thanks, Reese. And so, yeah, so we're going to wrap up here a few minutes ahead of time, so happy to give time back to folks. But just to reiterate, we've been getting a lot of questions in the comment field. If you're not yet a member of VCI but are interested in joining the general membership, we're also exploring one of the working groups. The first step to take is to go to the website. You see the link there, vaccinationcredential.org. And sign up and indicate your preference on what working groups you might be interested in. I know that the links have been sent out during the webinar itself, but just to reiterate, for those with technical interest, there's the Smart Health Card link, as well as the implementation guide link for the vaccine credential implementation guide itself. We welcome your input. We welcome you joining this effort. And implementing and really importantly, providing feedback to other implementers on how to improve the overall process. I've seen a number of comments and suggestions come in through the chat window. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have a very active Fire chat. And so if you're interested in joining that, certainly let us know and we'll get you plugged in. We thank you for your time. We will post these slides and this recording of this webinar after this, as well as an updated copy of the charter documentation for VCI, and look forward to working with all of you in the coming days and weeks. So thank you everyone for your time, and have a great rest of your day.